Now we're going to invite the moderator for the special session number 3, Adrift Connections Around the Asia, Professor Son Dong-ju, the head of the Humanities Korea Plus of the Busan University. Please welcome him with a big round of applause. Good morning. I am Son Dong-ju, Director of the Humanities Korea Plus of Busan University. So the topic of today's special session is Adrift Connections Around the World or Asia. When you think about being adrift, you may think about the winds or typhoons, and ships are wrecked and they just stay on the islands and they will lead a life there. That's kind of the general perception of the adrifting. But on the records of the adrift is a story about the people who wanted to go to some other destinations, and they kept a log of their journey until they came back to their hometown or their home country. The ocean Silk Road is most well represented in the city of Busan. In the past, Joseon Tungsinsa or the goodwill missions of Korea used this port, and during the modern times, a lot of people came and went, and a lot of goods were traded in this city. However, even before the modern times, there were a lot of people who were using these oceans for their journey, and the records of the drifting is a great evidence, historical materials that we can see what happened, because that's a story of the people who faced death and how they overcame all hardships and challenges during their journey. And during this special session 3, we will look into the records of the drifting, and we will see how the exchanges were taking place in the private sector, and we're going to see more opportunities for the cultural content and the creation of the new contents. Let's move on to our first speaker. First presentation is Asia's Drifting Records, Singing Asia Through the Eyes of Asia, and Professor Seok-Duk, Professor of the Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences, Busan National University, will present. Please welcome him. So, please. Good morning. My presentation, the title is Drifting Records of Asia and Singing Asia. And you've seen this video on our exhibition, and my presentation is really about the overview of the exhibition, and I will touch up on the other stuff that were not covered in the video. And as our moderator briefly mentioned, being drift, it's accident that happens on the sea. And after the 17th century, we started to see a lot of these seaborne accidents, and one reason for that is because we started to see a growing number of or volume of seaborne trade. More research might be needed on this, but when you look at the trade route in Asia between the 15th and the 16th centuries, and you can see Dongle near Busan city, and this picture shows how the trade were done around the city, and the trade routes were widely used for many maritime activities. However, with the leadership change in China after the 17th century, they banned the seaborne trade and other activities that were happening on the ocean, and they released or relaxed the ban. So at the government level, they banned these seaborne trade, and that stopped the trade at an official level. However, on the private sector, these exchanges and commercial activities still went on, and in particular with Japan and Jeju of Joseon, Taiwan, Ryukyu, and the Philippines were where we saw a lot of activities in terms of the seaborne trade. And these regions that I just mentioned, I will cover more about it later on. And these were where we saw a lot of the records on the drifting. So they went on the ship, and when you set for a sail, what is the destination or what is the purpose of having that? When they had this order or a ban on the seaborne activities or journey, then their purposes might have been for more private sector-driven purposes, not the official purposes like the diplomatic ties. And then when they came back, they had these wrecks or accidents on the sea. And although it is an accident, we could see these records. Because it's an accident, many people left these records or logs of what happened, and based on the records, we can assume what happened. And these drawings are the scroll of the seaborne journey or the drift to the Qing. And these records on drifting has two types. One is the official records. It describes what happened, and these are represented in the official documents or the history materials or the local records. And during the Joseon dynasty, we could see them in Chronicles of Three Kingdoms and Annals of Joseon Dynasty and all the other official records. And for the Qing dynasty, there's a chronology of Qing dynasty and addresses to the throne. And this is the Munjeong Byeoldan, the records on the Jeju returnees from drift, a part of the records of Border Defense Council. And this is from Qing dynasty, the addresses to the throne. So, as I briefly mentioned before, in terms of China, they don't have that many records on drifting, and for the reason we need to have more research. And when you look at these addresses to the throne, it's about the people who came to China, the drifters who came to China from the other countries. On the other hand, when you look at the private records about drifting, it's in forms of mythologies, tales, mysteries, essays, or drifting records. And for the Joseon dynasty, we can see them in the memorabilia of Three Kingdoms and collection of Eastern folk tales, and the Changhancheol's records on drifting in the sea, and the other records which are already discovered in the records on drifting sea from Chebu or the others. They have similar names, and the Pyohaerok or the records on drifting in the sea are the typical titles that we see. And for China, this is a very well-known storybook. Taiping Guangqi or the Yijianqi are the Chinese records on the drifting on the sea. So, in terms of the records on drifting in the sea, there are official or the public and the private records. And what are the differences between the two? For the official and the public records are mostly about the description of how these drift accidents happened and how that were handled and who were there and what were the purpose of the journey and when did it happen and how the accident went. So that is for the public records, and when you try to make some modifications, then it will turn into the fiction or some other stories. So this is an example. As you saw in the video, Kim Dae-hwang, some person was drifting from the Jeju Island through Vietnam. He came back, and the daily log of drifting on sea was record recorded in the Sukjongshillok or the annals of Sukjong the king, and we can see when you compare these to the records, you can see the differences. In terms of the private records, it's based on the person's drifting experience, their frustration, and how they overcame that challenge, and what they felt when they arrived in a whole new country or a foreign country. But the thing is that there might have been a lot of such drifting accidents, but we don't see many of the records because it's a matter of who authors the private records. So although people had these drifting experiences, they were not able to create a story. There should be someone who can turn that into written stories. So I will cover more on this later, but there are some reasons why we don't see so many records, and who made it into written records or in what language are also key as we look into the records. And these are the list of the Korean records on the drifting on the sea, and there might be more to come. And as you have seen from the video, these are kind of the well-known the records of drifting, and many are being translated in our the Humanities Korea Plus is also working on this, and these are from Chinese. Pan Jung-gyu's Drift Log to the South, which talks about his journey from China to Vietnam, and Jung Kwang-jo's Drifting Records in Foreign Seas from China to Japan, and Chae Jung-lan's Records on Southern Sea from Taiwan to Vietnam. And one typical characteristic of Chinese records is that they have very few private records written on the drifting in the sea, and I'll cover more on this about why is that. And this is about Japan because it's an island, and we see rather more records on drifting, and Ito Lannin's records, and what you see on the left is the diary of drifting in Joseon, and that's been translated. And I think Professor Park, who will present later, will also translate the other records. And this is about the Vietnam Trong Dan K's Not Bon Kien Van Luc, which is about the records on their journey to Japan. And as you can see here, it's in Chinese. So the characters are the Chinese characters were commonly used for these records because we were sharing this Chinese culture. And next, but the problem is when they had this wreckage and they had this drifting accident, they might die. And however, they safely came back, and that's how we can see the records of drifting. And also, the other thing that's of interest is that the place or the country where these drifters arrived sent them back to their own home country. And in terms of Chinese people, in Korea, when they came to Korea as a drifter, then depending on what they want, we send them back by sea or by land. And when they arrived in the western coast, then we send them back through the Uiju, the city, and depending on their place of origin, we send them to Beijing or to other cities. And for the Japanese drifters, we had investigation in Tsushima Prefecture, and depending on their addresses, we send them back to Japan. And in China, many drifters happen to arrive, and when they arrive in the coastal waters, then the officials of the provincial governments send some officials, and they do the investigation, and they provide some clothing and food, and they report it back to the main country. And when they arrive when Ryukyu people arrive in China, then they send them to Fuzhou, or from like the East Asian people arrive in China, then they send them back to Xiamen or Guangzhou, or they are from Vietnam, they send them to Guangdong or Guangxi or the other cities. If they are Joseon people or from Korea, then they send them back to Fangcheng or Uiju. So by country, I compared how they treat the drifters, and this is about the repatriation. When they arrive in Banju, then they send them to Songgyong or Apno River and Uiju. And when Japanese arrive in China, then at the time, the Qing dynasty and Japan didn't have any diplomatic ties, so all the handover were handled by the merchants of China. And when you read Kim Dae-wang's records on drift to Vietnam, in their journey from Vietnam to Jeju, they were on the ship of the merchants. And the Joseon, well, you can use the land road to arrive Joseon, but Japan was not really where you can access through the land road. And the repatriation caused by the Chinese and the Netherlands trade, the repatriation for that purpose was approved or allowed by the feudal government. So this whole repatriation process and the handover process were really depending on the diplomatic ties between the countries. And for Japan, they had 4 different channels: Tsushima, Matsumae, Nagasaki, and Satsuma. And for Korea, Tsushima, and for China and the Netherlands, Nagasaki were the connecting point, and that was how Japan repatriated the drifters. And for Japan, during the Tokugawa feudal government, when they arrived, they sent them to Nagasaki and Tsushima for repatriation. And when they arrived in Ejochi, maybe the next presenter will cover on this, then about this case. And when they arrive in Ejochi, then they have to go through Edo. And this whole process of repatriation were fully in place in 1630. And all the foreign ships that came to or entered into Japan used the Nagasaki port, and Joseon drifters or their ships were not an exception. So that was how they repatriated the drifting people or the ships. So as we are doing this study on Busan port city or the Nagasaki, when you learn more about it, even before the modern times, they had very close ties in terms of this trade. However, we need to look into the further historic materials. So there are some limitations to prove that, but that's what we see now. And in terms of the Chinese drifters, compared to Joseon, it was a very strict in terms of the process, and some drifters were not allowed to enter the port. And so these Chinese drifters, their repatriation was handled at the port of Nagasaki, and they sent them all to the port of Nagasaki, and they had to go to their home country at their own expenses or with their own means. And when they arrived in Nagasaki, then the official center handling foreign affairs managed the process. So when you look at the process, you can learn more about how these 3 countries were having their diplomatic relations. Now, I have a few slides before we close. So up until now, I touched upon the materials that were already available. So now I want to talk about the East Asian perspective on the records of the drifting. As my title indicates, this requires more research, but it can be an interesting question. So after the 17th century, we saw a huge increase in terms of the records in drifting. Of course, I don't mean that it was a huge, like a soaring number, but compared to the previous years, there was an increase. And Japan's a leading ocean researcher, Hamashita Takeshi, also mentioned that from Joseon, they had this like a large trade network, and Joseon was, not a big part of it. There's not much records that can support that. And he asked the question, and we started to focus on these records of the drifting, and we have more such records than the other countries. So the people who left for the sea, who were they and why they were taking this journey? And when we can find the answer, I think one reason might be because of the commercial trade. Some people say that these records might be fake because they had this ban on the official trade, on the seaborne trade. So they just faking and pretend that they were having this drifting accident. So that will explain why we started to see more records of drifting showed up in or after 17th century. It could be just one, not all, the explanation. And as you can see on the map, these are the winds and the currents, and they didn't have any motor or engines for the ship, so they had to follow these winds and the currents. And in the East Asia, these were the directions or the movements of the winds and the currents, and they had to stop or arrive where these winds and currents led them. And also, as I briefly mentioned before, we were sharing this culture of the Chinese characters. We had these Chinese characters, and when we looked into how many days they stayed and when they send them back, and along the way they are happen to have this cultural or other exchanges between different cultural circles. And in Vietnam's case, their records were also in Chinese, although they didn't speak Chinese. In terms of the written language, they share this Chinese character as a cultural circle. And I believe the value of the records of drifting is immense because it's about the culture or literature, maybe not about the history, but in terms of the literature, art or the works, they have a very good expressions and of very high literature values. So it would mean a lot. And in terms of the historic values, of course, it will carry out a very strong and high significance, because so these records on drifting may have values in terms of history and the literature as well. And also they are a very good cultural contents that can be used for like the comic content or for children's books, and they can be a good materials for education. And there are many documentaries based on these records on drifting. So it can be a very good and rich source of cultural contents. So we are now looking into the Asia through the eyes of Asia, then we can have better mutual understanding of the Asian countries, because based on these records of the drifting and comparing them, we can have a better understanding of the culture and history of East Asia and understand each other's culture and also reconstruct the historical status. So that's it for my presentation. Thank you.
예, 서 교수님, 귀한 발표 내용 감사드립니다. 오늘 서 교수님은
Thank you for the great presentation, Professor Seo. That was a very good presentation on the records of the drifting in the sea, and he covered on the many great evidence and the culture and historical materials, and he provided a very good perspective on how we should approach this whole records. And we will move on to the next speaker.
한국해양대학
Our next presentation will be provided by Professor Kim Gang-sik of Korea Maritime and Ocean University. He will make a presentation on the story of the drifting through Busan, Hokkaido, and Tsushima. Please, you have 20 minutes for your presentation. I am Kim Kwang-sik from Busan Maritime and Ocean University. Today, it is such a pleasure for me to make a presentation about 이지항's Pyohaerok. In the pre-modern era, the drifting was very dangerous, and it happened a lot because the size of vessel was quite small, and most of them in the vessel died. But some of them survived and drifted to some areas and back to their hometown safely. So they were very lucky people. So it is very few who wrote a journal about their drifting story. So today I'll make a presentation about by using the 이지항's Pyohaerok, who drifted from Busan, Hokkaido to Tsushima. So you only gave me 20 minutes, but according to my resume, I made a presentation for just 20 minutes. 이지항, it is also recorded as 이선달, and his ancestors lived in the Yeongcheon in Gyeongsangbuk-do province and moved into the Donglebu in Busan. And he, in 1647, he was born, the 25th year of King Injo's reign, and in 1675, he passed the state examination and passed. Then he joined the Suocheong, which is the department to guard the Naman-sansang, but his father died. Then he back to his hometown in Busan. So this book is a list of people who passed the test, the military to join the military service. And here we can see the name 이지항, who is born in Yeongcheon and lived in Dongdae in Busan. But through the online, we can check the record about 이지항. That some article said 이지항 was born in 1756, but it should be corrected, I think. And there are several kinds of 이지항's Pyohaerok, but this one is saved in the National Central Library. Then there are two types of 이지항's Pyohaerok. And within that document, we can see some lines, and those are the name of people who drifted with 이지항. And when I tracked the data about 이지항, I found this at Hokkaido City Hall. In Hokkaido City Hall, they published in 1936 about the new history of Hokkaido, and in volume 5, it collected the history about Hokkaido, and here we can see the data of the information about 이지항's Pyohaerok. The people in Hokkaido investigated the 이지항 and their party. So through this document, I think that we thoroughly knew what the 이지항's situation back then. So in 1696, 이지항 stayed in Busan, his back hometown, but he had to work in Wonju, Gangwon-do province. So he needed to back to the Wonju, but it took so long if he go to inland. So instead, he chose to take a ship, like a ship selling fish. So he paid and aboard. And after he was on board, So there are other companies who want to go to the Wonju, and there are some sailors who sell the fishes. So we saw the name Gongcheol, residents of Busan, also took the ship together. The reason of drift was, so most of the drift was caused by usually caused by some strong winds in the sea near the Korea. So most records about the drift said that those drift occurred due to the wind near the Korean coastal area. So when they left Busan and moved to the Yeongdo, currently it's a Busan, but it's a kind of Gyeongsangnam-do province. Anyway, they had a very strong wind near the Busan area and were drifted. How about the deep sea? When they moved into the deep sea, the current could be the main reason for the drift. There is a crucial current existed in this route, and they were drifted by the Tema current and moved to the side of East Sea and got affected by the Riemann current. And maybe you can see the picture later, but so this because of those two currents, they were drifted to the Hokkaido. So this is the picture of the current. This is the newest. Current flows in Northeast Asian seas. The red one is the crucial current. The main current went down to Japan, but now it also passed to the Tsushima Strait between Korea and Japan, and moved to the north side of Japan. And Yeonheju current also goes down to the Japan and Korea side, and there is some circulations. So it is possible to drift it to the north of the Hokkaido. So I think it was possible to drift it to these areas. And back then, there was a list of who were on board. It is quite rare because it is not easy to leave some records about who was on board, because to make a record, people who know the Chinese character should on board. So except for Lee Ji-hyang, there were 8 people, 4 from Ulsan, and the master of the ship is Kim Ki-dong, and the rower was on board. So all combined, 8 people was on board. So how they arrived into the north side of Hokkaido? So in 1696, April 13th, they left Busan. But they are kind of sailors, so it took some time. Anyway, in April 28th, they were drifted. So, and they moved to the north of the Hokkaido, the Mishido, at May 11th. And there, they asked help to the Aborigines for food. And they moved down to the mainland of Japan, mainland of Japan, and there they arrived at Smaebu. And since then, they met Japan, and they get well served by the Japanese people. Back then, the people in Joseon were drifted to Japan, mainly drifted to Japan, but normally to the Kyushu area. from Nagasaki, Tsushima. So they back to from Nagasaki to Tsushima to Korea, or sometimes Tsushima to Korea to Joseon. After the Japanese invasion to Korea, they've been to the Osaka, and the Tsushima to Busan is the main route. So in 1897, 1 year later, January 14th, they back. So it took about 1 year, 11 months. It took back to their hometown. This is when they drifted from Ulsan and they moved to the Hokkaido, as I explained before. Due to the current, they went to the north of the Hokkaido and down to the Japan, and they were saved from the aborigines and moved to the Osaka and Tsushima and back to Busan. When those drifters arrived, then the destination country always investigated them thoroughly. So they were investigated in Masayamagu, and they left. They were there. All the belongings and goods were investigated by the Japan, and most of them are for belongings are for regular use and clothes. And Ijihang held so many books. So this is a process when they were drifted. At the end of Joseon era, the relationship between China, Korea, and Japan, we actually kind of served to China. And after the United regime started in Japan, they tried to get rid of this kind of relationship. But anyway, still the relationship between Joseon and Japan, after the Japan's invasion to Japan, it was a kind of friendly relationship. So the process for the drifters in Japan and the investigation was conducted in a kindly manner. So after those friendly investigation, those drifters moved to the Edo, and all those processes were written in detail. And all the drifters when they arrived in Japan, they exchanged some products, what they need. So for them, they also received some products which was needed for survive. So for Ijihang and two other people on board received some different items because of the social level. But the most difficult thing is the communication, because they wanted to introduce themselves from and where they are from, but the language, because of the language gap, they couldn't communicate thoroughly. Still, we couldn't. We used some body language to communicate in any way. So when they arrived in Hokkaido, Ejo area, before that it was not belong to Japan. So the Japanese was not used there. So when they arrived in Hokkaido, some people came and talked, but no one couldn't understand. On the second process in Matsuyame, when they arrived in the Japanese area, they can communicate in Japanese. Because in Busan, there was an area where Japanese people lived, so people who lived there can speak in Japanese. So one of them in Kim Deok-sun could speak in Japanese, so they could easily communicate in the Japan. However, in the Hokkaido area, they had some difficulties in communication. So Lee Ji-young also left some record about those difficulties in communication. In Mazumai, he left a record by only relying on the sounds of those Aborigines. And here's Akira. In Chinese word wagara, which means water. Here's Abi. In Chinese character is Abi, but it sounds like ape, but it means a fire. So they learned some basic words and tried to communicate with the people, the Aborigines in Hokkaido, and moved down to the Japan. And in the Hokkaido, Lee Ji-young couldn't communicate, but when he arrived in Matsuyama, he could communicate with the people in Japan. So they spoke to the officials dispatched to Matsuyama. There was gold miners. So with the people who were responsible for the gold miner and the public officials and merchants, Lee Ji-young had an opportunity to talk with them. In Hokkaido, the leather were mainly produced. So there was a merchants who visit there to trade the leathers. And there were some monks in Japan. They also knew Chinese characters, so it was possible to communicate with them. And whenever we are in a difficult situation, we always try to exchange what we had to survive. So through this kind of exchange, they received various products from Ejo. So to survive. And also they trade with some clothes, like a leather, to protect themselves. So various kinds of trade was conducted in Hokkaido. So when they experienced a drift in the Northeast Asian region, many people live there, believe the god of sea, so they prayed to the god of sea to save them. And many Eastern people predict their future based on the book, whether they will survive or not. And East Asian region, people in Korea and in China and Japan believed Buddha. So those religion was widely spread. So people prayed to their God what they believed. And Lee Ji-young also left a record about the environment, customs, and what they wear in Hokkaido. There are very few Joseon people who visit Hokkaido. So Hokkaido is quite near to Russia, actually. So they are very tall and very hairy. So the Lee Ji-young left all those unique conditions and situations of Hokkaido in detail. And in Hokkaido is quite a northern area, which means that the snow did not melt down in May. So the meaning of the Lee Ji-young's Phyohaerok is that it is a record of hands-on experience about the northeast side of Japan, which were not developed back then. So few people know about the information about those areas, but through this Phyohaerok written by Lee Ji-young, we can see the cultures and customs of the Hokkaido back then. And as I mentioned before, the drift is not just end as a drift itself. Drift is related to the coming back to their hometown. So the relation between two countries is really important. So we can see that after the Japan's invasion to Korea, the relationship between two countries became amicable and friendly. So the wrecked ship, the EGN asked to bring their wrecked ship to Joseon. So Ejo people sent those wrecked ship to Joseon. It also showed that how amicable they were. And I am a professor of Korea's Maritime and Ocean University. The reason why we focus on the Pyohaerok is the route, sea route. The navigation of sometimes we can go back. So in the past, we need to follow the current. So this is a matter of navigation, a matter of route. So in deciding the route, the current is very important. So drifting itself is an accident, but the route which was found through the drift was a good information to find a new route. So the area where the drift actually occurred is a good point to find a good route or a good way to find a good how to navigate. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening. Thank you very much, Professor Kim. So today, the Lee Ji-hyung's Pyohaerok was the main topic of your presentation when he left Busan, arrived to Hokkaido and to Masayama and back to Joseon. The customs of Japan and the customs of Hokkaido were well written, well recorded, and the records like they were tall and hairy means maybe they were Ainu, the Aborigines. So the records that Lee Ji-hyung wrote back to Joseon showed the information about their nature, environment, customs, and clothes. Thank you very much. And next we'll move to the third presentation.
Professor Igunu of History of the Busan University will talk about the value of drawing data in drift diary to Joseon. I don't have any watch, I can see the time, but I'll try to make it by 20 minutes. So my presentation is about the drift diary to Joseon, written by Japanese, about their experience about drifting to Joseon. It covers a lot of stuff, but what's really noteworthy is that there are a lot of drawings. So I will present mostly on the drawings. Okay, so we're gonna see how these drifters were doing at the time of the drift. So it started from Okinawa-Erabujima, which is current Okinawa Island, and at the time it was called Satsuma Prefecture, so it was very southern part of Kyushu, and for 2 years they were working on that as an official duty, and on their way back to their hometown they were hit by a typhoon. And this spot numbered as number 1 was where they started to go back to Kagoshima, but they happened to arrive. This is the starting point, and they happened to arrive and here, although they tried to go back to Kagoshima. So this is the current Seocheon area. At the very tip of this city, we can see the Maryangjin, and that's where they ended up after drifting. So that's where this whole drift diary starts. And the Yashida, the author, is a warrior, and he also left the drawing of the port. And that is the port or one of the drawings that we could see from the Drift Diary as Maryangjin. It's very detailed, and all these routes and paths, and we can see the seawall here. And inside the seawall, we can see Maryangjin, a base for military base, and they could not get in there at first, and they were drifting, and they kept a very close records of that where they stayed, on what dates. And on their way back, they also kept a log of the drift, and what's of really value is their records of how they travel this sea route. It's not just about general description, but he drew like a red line to mark his own journey on the map. So by passing through these islands and Palgumdo and through this southern coast, he went to Dadepo and Uampo, and he stayed there, and through Sisima and Nagoshima, and he came back to his own hometown. So that is kind of a journey by the dates. His journey started in 1819, like 200 years ago from now, and they set out the journey in June. So this Drift Diary, I mean, we heard about a lot of many different diaries, but this diary is composed of drawings, like 37 pages of drawings, unlike the other record, which are mostly written in characters. And it also covers the conflict he had, or the author experienced, with the Joseon officials. So it's not just a simple description of his journey or the drift route, but it contains very detailed description of what he experienced. And this picture is the typhoon that he had when he started the journey from, or when he started to be drifted from Erabujima. And this is a picture or the drawing where his ship was sinking. And the author was like a middle-level warrior, but he was able to read the Chinese characters and write a Chinese poem. So he was one of intellectuals. And even some Joseon people asked him to draw a picture. So, and that was also covered in this diary. And this one is already mentioned, so I will skip the slide. And also, he has description of the Joseon government officials. My rough impression after I read it was in the 1800s, during the Joseon dynasty, the Joseon, in the eyes of the Western people, were really not clean. It was not really cultured or civilized. And when you read this Drift Diary, in the eyes of Yasuda, he was looking at Joseon from a very friendly and warm perspective, not as some people that needs to be civilized. And in the Korean history textbook, we learned that, or we were taught that the Joseon dynasty collapsed because of the corrupt officials, but from his description, there's only one corrupt government official, which shows that he had a very positive perception of the Joseon dynasty. So in the late Joseon dynasty, we had this bias that the society was very corrupt, but maybe it's not. And when it comes to the people of Joseon dynasty, about the hats or the clothing or the garments, because Japanese officials or warriors didn't have much hair, or they were bald. However, many Korean officials were wearing hats. So Japanese called Joseon a country of hat. So that was quite interesting to this author. And also, they also dyed a feather of an elephant and used it for their garment to mark which military unit they were belonging to. So that was another interesting point this person described. And these are the women of the time who are wearing the blue, or the unmarried ladies, and in white clothes they are the married women. And they were holding this ware, which is called like a rag. We don't see them much these days, but with this rag, they collect something and put it into their rug. And this is a person who was being punished for stealing something from others. So they were being punished by the government officials. And what we see on the right is the head or the senior officials. And there are many other tools or the gears they used. So very detailed, and that really tells us a lot about these gears. And the Joseon people's drawings were kind of rough, but these drawings are very detailed in the eyes of a Japanese author. And this one is like a package of rice they used for carrying rice as a straw bag. And also we can see the thatched roof houses. So as I mentioned before, it presents quite refreshing and different perspectives than those of the Western authors or Western people, and it's also different from what we know as a common sense of these times. Different hats were got. We can see this feather, and when you see the location of these feathers, depending on where they put the feather, it shows your position or the ranking in the military or in the government. And also you can see the hairstyle of the Joseon people, how they style their hairs. And the top knot or sangtu is what Joseon man used to have. And also the hats and the top knot of their hairstyle, you can see the drawing, and the maryangjin. And this one is Yoon Young-gyu, a person, and this official is the one the author met. And when you look at the details, well, at first glance, I didn't recognize it, but here you can see dotted lines. It means tanlik, which is like the military garment for warriors or the military officials. At usual times or at regular times, they won't really put it into the drawings, but this author made a very detailed and differentiated drawings. And this person is supposed to wear a blue belt, but this person is now wearing a red belt. So it may be one of the custom, or this person named Yoon Young-gyu might have been appointed to some special position. So Yasuda, the warrior or the author, met this person, and he described this person as someone who had a very strong and very good personality and integrity. And he was a very friendly person. So when he had any like the pains in his belly, then he cared for him. And So they had a very candid conversation as he cured him. We thought that these high-ranking officials or yangban, who are the high class of the time, were not really friendly or kind, but from their conversation we can see they were very friendly, kind. And this is the huido, or you can see another garment, and inside the socks they carried a lot of pencils or the stationaries, and this was not really reported or mentioned in other historic evidence, but this was kind of a very first time that, because he is a servant or official to serve his master or the head of the government, so he had to carry that all the time. And this is another stationery that the Joseon people used, but we haven't heard about it before. And when you continue to pull this off, you can have like 6 different brushes out of this brush case. So they have different sizes in terms of these brushes, from small to like a large ones, and when you just carry one case you can have 6 different brushes. And there's also a fan, and Yasta was very interested in watching Joseon people using these fans. And in the case of Yoon Kyung-gyu, Mr. Yoon, he asked him to give one to him, but Mr. Yoon refused because this is really important for me. I can't give it to anyone else, so I'll give you a new one. So he came up with a new fan to give it as a present to Yasta. And at the end of this fan, at the tip, there is a different like the decorations, like a different scents, and you can add as you want. Have you seen this, Mr. Min? Because he is an expert on the Korean ships, and this is a drawing of the Korean ship at the time. Of course, there are some mistakes or the failures in terms of these whole tools or the mast, but still it's a very detailed description. And also here you see another tool to raise the mast, and it shows how Joseon people used that. And in the exhibition of the Asia Cultural Institute, they created as a bookmark with this drawing. And there's another interesting drawing here. So the author described the life of Joseon people, and on the other hand, he wrote about his own route, how they moved from this mountain to Wido Island, starting from Maryangin to Pogum Mountain to Palgumdo. So this whole journey or the route was typically taken or not taken by merchants. From as I see it, Yasta's return route was intentionally changed or modified for some military reason. So there is some kind of the motive of Joseon people, because they didn't tell him the name of the mountain. And Yasta, when he saw the mountain along the coastlines, there were 2 houses, and he called it like an island with 2 houses, because no one at the time told him the true name of the island, so he named it. So for the Joseon officials, they didn't want to share this information, like geographic information, with these Japanese. And there's a Yongpo, Busanpo, and Jeonpo. They had these 3 different towns, and there's a route, and the route was how Japanese people attacked during this Imjin War. So maybe they didn't want to share that information with this author. And this is around the capital, and the route looks like he was really he might be lost, because he was like taking circles around this capital. And finally, after this island with the two houses. After he passing through the island, he got sick and he could not continue to keep logs or the drawings, so he just had a very rough illustrations, so we don't have much information about the southern part of his journey or the Korea. And next it's about Busan. So for a quite long time, well, in terms of the period, Dadaepo, Uanpo are where he stayed the longest time, and we could see many different and detailed pictures or drawings. This is the Uanpo. And well, I happened to move to near this Uanpo area, and I compared our current region and with this map. And around the Uanpo, at the time they had like a 100 like houses. It's a fishing village. In Uanpo, he stayed on the boat, and few foreigners happened to get to the land. So the officials of the Sisima carried a small boat, and they approached to this Uanpo, and they asked the Joseon people to have serum or some sports. And about the Uanpo drawing, we can see like a red mountain without trees, and on the other mountains we can see the trees, but for this specific mountain there are few trees. I don't know why, but this is the mountain that's called like a red mountain without any trees. And also we can see also drawing of Dadaepo where he stayed for a month. This is Dadaepo. And we can see their route or way in and way out. And what you see in the middle of the left, there are other ships which colored in brown, but there's other ships that are, or the lines with the blue or the black are the ships that were carried out by Wegan, or where they started to get investigation about how they came to end up in this area. And here they have 3 warriors or samurais, and 1 person died on the ship, and they talked about how to deal with the dead body. And the one dead person was buried in the Pokbyong mountain, and until the Japanese rule area, we still had that tomb of the samurai. Well, I don't know what happened now, but it was there like decades ago. So Weguan, well, my expertise is not really about the drifting records or diaries, but this is what I learned. The Japanese who were drifted to Joseon were all sent to Wegan, and in the Sisima they went back to Nagasaki for interrogation, and they were sent back to their original destination. So in Wegan, we could see the official records of the interrogation of the samurais or the warriors, although I haven't really checked that myself for sure. So this drift diary to Joseon, I covered important components of the diary, and from the drawings we could learn that there are some facts that are different from what we've known as a fact, and later on Western people had their own records of Joseon, and the perspectives of Western people and Japanese people were very different. So I think time's up, and that's it. Thank you. Well, Mr. Lee, Professor Lee, thank you for a great presentation. The Drift Diary to Joseon was not really translated before, and June this year, with the help of the Humanities Korea Plus of Busan University, Professor Lee translated that. So he also held the conference in Seocheon, and we held the exhibitions of the drawings and the scrolls. So we are now having good understanding of this Drift Diary, which was written by a warrior on his journey from Okinawa to Kagoshima, but he landed on Seocheon and he passed through Uampo and Dadepo, and he shared his observations about Busan. So it was a very great presentation, although it needs more analysis and research, but it means a lot. So I think many people are very interested in this whole material. Thank you.
마지막
Now, Professor Park Hwa-jin, the Department of the History of Busan National University, will make a presentation on the marine experience and the recognition in the travel literature of Joseon 통신사. I am Park Hwa-jin of Busan National University. I'm not majored in Joseon 통신사, which is the goodwill mission of Korean mission to Japan, but I helped and joined many research about this topic. So today, I want to share with you about the marine experience and the cognition in the travel literature of Joseon 통신사. So first, what is Joseon 통신사? So I just simply explained, but mainly I want to talk about the whole route from Joseon 통신사 to from Busan to Tsushima to Japan, the Iki, the second stopovers, and third stopover Ainoshima, and arrived in Shimonoseki port. So I want to share the marine experiences when they passed the Straits of Korea. So from 1907 and 1811, 12 Joseon 통신사 were dispatched to Japan, and they left Busan and arrived in Edo Makbu in Japan. All those records about those process is included in my document. For about 210 years, the cultural exchange about this Joseon 통신사 were registered as UNESCO Memory of the World on October 31st, 2017. So we need to have more interest in this topic. After the Japan's invasion to Korea, after the war in 1592, the Tokugawa shogunate ruled Japan and asked a diplomatic tie to Korea. In 1599, the Joseon dynasty rejected, but in 1600, the Tsushima sent Koreans, Joseon people back to Joseon. So they signed a Kyu Treaty and restarted these diplomatic ties. So the Joseon dynasty was the only country that Tokugawa shogunate made a diplomatic tie. And since then, the 12 Joseon 통신사 were dispatched for about 210 years. So from first to third war, they were called like 회례겸 쇠한사, and they renamed as 통신사. And this is the painting about the Joseon 통신사. They held the blue flags. And move to the next slide. This is a slide showing some blue dragons, and it is a representative of the history. It is a kind of carriage holding the king's letter. Let's say the size of the Joseon 통신사. So there are three main government officials and painters, and about 504 or sometimes 328 people. And they started from Hanyang, which is Seoul, and moved to Busan, and Busan to Tokugawa shogunate. So this is a list of Joseon 통신사 from 1st to 11th. This is the route of the Joseon 통신사. So from Busan, they passed the Strait of Korea. So within the Joseon, they started from Hanyang to Busan and three routes, and to Japan they passed the Tsushima to Osaka, which is a sea road, and from Yodo to Edo, they walked, and they anyway moved inland. So here I dealt with about the route from Tsushima to Shimonoseki. This is a painting about the whole group. So all the stopovers in Japan, where the Joseon 통신사 stopped by, the whole journey took about 6 to 12 months, and it is about 30,000 kilometers. It's a round trip. So within the Japan, they passed Tsushima and Ainoshima to Shimonoseki, and there Joseon 통신사 experienced very severe marine experiences because the route was quite dangerous. The Strait of Korea, the passage of the Strait of Korea was very, very dangerous. So people who joined this journey were quite scared and feared about this. So here we can see the route from Busan. I couldn't point it correctly, but so from Busan, it is the destination where the Joseon 통신사 leave and arrive. So hundreds of Joseon 통신사 gathered in Busan, and they checked all the belongings and all the required diplomatic documents and ships and the depth of water, and they also exercised onboarding, and they also had some ceremony or kind of pray to the god of sea. And also dozens of ships from Tsushima were dispatched to escort the Joseon 통신사, and in Tsushima dozens to hundreds of ships were waited for escorting this Joseon 통신사. The wind direction was really important for their safe journey, because this sea route was quite difficult for them, because many of them, it was the first time to take the ship. So they prayed a kind of ceremony, a ritual, to pray for the god of the sea. So they stayed in Busan for about 16 days to 51 days, but out of 12, 5 times they stayed more than 40 days. So when they left to Busan port, sometimes they back from Dadepo or Yeongdo, near the Oryukdo. They couldn't depart to Japan. They just waiting for the proper wind direction and waves. And during those time, they visited some good areas like Haeundae or Moreundae, and those are the dates they stayed in Busan from 1st to 12th. This is kind of farewell ceremony. This is held by Gyeongsang Jasuyong with the support by Gyeongsang Usuyong, and the place it is held in the guest house, kind of guest house. So they are very feared of passing about the journey. So it was a kind of big ceremony, a kind of big festival for Busan residents. All the government officials wear some black or red garments and sat opposite to the Chasusa and seeing the north side, and Chasusa sit on the west wall, against the west wall. And they set up a big table in the middle, and there was some kind of performance. And they enjoyed this festival, this party till late night. So in our residents in Dongdae and Busan Port enjoy those festivals together. This ritual for the god of the sea is really important. It is carried out based on the national ritual book. So from the 1st to 3rd, the rite was held right before the departure, but since the 4th, 15 or 30 days before the departure, usually it was held at 11 p.m. to 1 a.m. And it is held in Yeonggade. So tomorrow in Busan, Joseon Tongsinsa ceremony was delayed. So tomorrow evening in Yeonggade, we will have the ritual for sea gods. So for example, we have Pyohaerok, the name of the book. We have detailed information about this Hae Shinje. Some low-level official of Dongdaebu asked to prepare some document for this ritual. So prepare to departure. When they arrived in Busan, they checked the Joseon Tongsinsa people arrived in Busan. They checked the ships and exercise boarding and checked the cargoes, and they adjust some masts and measure the length and width and height of the ships, and they also investigated kind of the depth of water. And the ships from Japan were dispatched to escort Joseon Tongsinsa. So all the sailors from Korea, Joseon and Japan were cooperated together. So sometimes there were some arguments about the wind directions among the sailors, whether it was okay to depart or sometimes it was not okay to depart. Anyway, they had some communication about to make the journey safe. So the whole process of depart is that all the officials wear some formal garments and on board, and they sat after shooting some cannons, and all the residents in that area farewelled to pray their safe journey. So there are about 10 to 20 ships were dispatched from Tsushima to escort, and in Waniura or Sasima, there are dozens to hundreds of ships were waiting for escorting them. So the most important thing for safe journey is wind direction. So northeast wind is the best for the safe journey. Because the Tsushima is located down to the southeast side, so the wind direction really important to make all journeys safe and complete. So when I reviewed all 12 their documents about the Joseon Tongsinsas, so they left some their marine experiences, like they rise to the endless sky and down to the bottomless, and many were suffered from sea sicknesses. But at the later of the Joseon dynasty, during these journeys, no one died. Thanks to the marine knowledge of our ancestors, I think. In 1719, but the ships waiting in Fukuoka, 41 ships were wrecked and 60 were died. The ship of Joseon Tongsinsa were detailedly painted in the Japan's material. There are 6 ships, 2 large, 2 medium, and 2 small ships. And the dragons were painted. So in the modern era, we have some concept that how others think about us. So as we can see the paintings of the ships, they drew dragons. So and there is some areas to sleep and to cook. And chairs and curtains are installed. And there's a mark for each government officials. And also there are some areas to set up some armors. In 1655 and 1748 and 1763, those 3 times they had very severe experiences, especially. So in 1655, in June 19th, they started from Busan, and the wind was okay, but the wind became stronger, and many of them were suffered from seasickness, and they cried due to the high waves and strong waves. Some part of the ship were broken, and the ship rose to the sky and down to the bottomless. Is almost near to death. It was the first experience they never had before. In 1748, also they experienced a very high and volatile waves. No one answered, even though they were called. In 1763, the eastern northerly winds blew all day. They arrived in Chasupo. So they departed at 11 p.m. But when they saw other ships rose to the sky and fell down to the bottomless. So all the people in the ship were very scared and feared about the situation. This is the painting about their drifting. The left one is painted by Takusai Hokusai, showing the Fuji mountain. And on the right side, this is the ship meeting some storms. In Japan's drifting painting was quite detailed, but Korea's they focus more on writings than paintings. The Muriyama Teijiro wrote about these experiences as Satsuma, so writers worked together with the painters and left some records about their experiences. So they depart from Busan and moved to the Shimonoseki port. And the oceans, the Strait of Korea, are quite a dangerous route. So from in Tsushima, in Iki, and Ainoma, there were ships of Japan waiting for them. But in Ainoshima, in 1719, there were accident which wrecked Fukuoka ships. 41 ships and 61 died. So Joseon Tongsinsa stayed in Iki Island for 11 days. But July 24th in Ainoshima prepared for escorting Joseon Tongsinsa, and there were 41 ships and 41 ships were wrecked and 61 died due to the accident. And in Shimonoseki, hundreds of ships were waiting for their escorting. So to reach the Shimonoseki, the whole sea route was quite dangerous and very volatile. So Tsushima, Iki, Ainoshima. So Tsushima was the kind of a good destination to make a diplomatic agreement. So from Waniura to Hood, it took some time. to get there. So, and they made some adjustment in there, so they stayed to Tsushima quite long. If it's a stopover, they stayed only one day. So Iki and Ainoshima, it was common to stay only one day, but in the Strait of Korea, because of the wind direction, sometimes they stayed longer than one day. So in Iki Island, they stayed more than 20 days in 1763. In Ainoshima, they stayed 23 days, even though it's a stopover. That is the longest stop days they stayed in the stopover. In Osaka, Edo is a special area. It's not a stopover. In 1711, Tsushima, Iki, and Inoshima, Ainoshima, and Edo. Tsushima, except for the Tsushima, Iki, and Osaka. Okay, I'm sorry. They stayed Iki and Ainoshima for more than 9 days, which is quite long. This is the painting where the Joseon ships enter into the Tsushima. The first stopover of Japan is Tsushima. There are several reasons that they have to stay longer. But second stopover, Iki, most time they stopped in Iki and they visited 8 times when they back to Joseon Dynasty. Iki, they entered the Katsumoto port at the northwest side of Iki and stayed 2 days, at least 2 days, and sometimes 20 days. This is a painting of the Iki or Katsumoto. This is a painting. They escorting and welcoming the Joseon Tongsinsa. So they prepared 100 ships to welcome Joseon Tongsinsa and set up a guest house, a huge guest house to serve the Joseon Tongsinsa properly. And they spent like 7,500 kilograms of rice and 15,000 eggs. And the previous painting was included in the UNESCO's Memory of the World. And Ainoshima, the third stopover, is the last stopover in the Strait of Korea. So between the Ainoshima and Iki and Ainoshima, there's no land they can stop over. So always there's some dangers to be drifted. So always they always pay attention to the wind directions. So in 1763, they stayed more than 23 days. This is the picture, a painting of Ainoshima on the left. Bottom of the left side is where the guest house for the Joseon Tongsinsa was located. So I told about Fukuoka's accident in 1719 when Joseon Tongsinsa waited for the proper wind direction when they stayed for about 11 days. But there was 41 ships from Fukuoka and sailors were wrecked and died. So all the guest house also were damaged. The guest house in Ainoshima prepared for Joseon Tongsinsa also were damaged. So we restored this ship for Joseon Tongsinsa. This is how they welcome the Joseon Tongsinsa. So Joseon Tongsinsa's, when they built Joseon Tongsinsa's West House, they about 3,500 people were worked, and they used 931 pieces of tatami. This is how they organized the ships to welcome the Joseon Tongsinsa when they enter into the Shimonoseki port. The ships like a crane. So in the middle, there are 3 government officials of the Joseon dynasty, the high-level people. And this is the painting when the Joseon Tongsinsa enter into the Kaminoseki port. So Joseon Tongsinsa ship gave some good deep impression to Japan. So they left several paintings drawing Joseon Tongsinsa's ships. And there's some kind of lunchbox. We also see this kind of ships painted. And also we can see how the ships of Joseon Tongsinsa are painted on this curtain. And this is the painting that Joseon Tongsinsa are moved to the smaller boat to enter into the guest house. And it is Joseon Tongsinsa Jeong, which is displayed in the Japanese art gallery. And also there is Joseon Tongsinsa's painting was drawn. And it is a lunchbox. Also, we can see the Joseon Tongsinsa. In 18, and there we also have some plate drawn the Joseon Tongsinsa's record. The marine experience passing the Strait of Korea was very dangerous, but there was a few accidents occurred in Joseon Tongsinsa's journey. Only some in Japan we had a big accident. The Fukushima one experienced a big accident. So anyway, it was quite a dangerous route. The most important thing for the safe journey was wind direction. So they preferred east northerly wind or north wind or east wind. But in the journal, we haven't seen any drift or drift records accident, thanks to the marine knowledge of our ancestors. Even though there were some conflicts with sailors from Japan, but our ancestors' very careful judgment was helpful for making a safe journey. So we have seen many documents about Joseon Tongsinsa, but the lack of documents about this marine experience and marine journey. So it is. I think it is a good idea to research the shape of ship of Joseon Tongsinsa. Thank you. Professor Wok, thank you very much. So 3 presenters talk about the marine experiences in the private sector, and Professor Bach mentioned about the experiences of Joseon Tongsinsa, which is a public exchange in public, and what kind of ceremony they had in Busan before departing, and what kind of route they took before they enter into Japan. So thank you for all 4 speakers. So we'll have a 10 minutes break, and we'll move on to the discussion session. Due to time limits, please make it to less than 2 minutes, please. And we're going to start from the Education Contents Development Team Leader, An Jae-yeon of Asian Culture Institute. Good morning, I am An Jae-yeon, the team leader of the Asia Culture Institute. I want to ask about the E.G. Hang's route to Professor Kim. There are 2 questions. First, in terms of these drift records from Asia, when you read the records, they have these descriptions of the sea routes, and that helped the next generations, following generations, to understand about their sea-borne routes. So, do we have any cases where their following generations have, after they read these records, did they have the actual
enhancement in terms of their understanding about these past sea routes? That's the first question. And shall I ask the second question now? Or yes, the second question is, from China we have other records on drift, and they are very focused on the Chinese perspectives. We have a very strong sense of their own self as a country. However, Joseon people, they have like there is kind of the understatement of the poem, and the poems were not really good. So I want to know if it's really the case, or they didn't have any evidence for that.
Okay, so we will make an answer after all four of us ask questions. And next question from Professor Jung Sun-hye from Gwangju Women's University. I have a question to Professor Park. So Professor Park talked about the log written by the Joseon 통신사, and you made a presentation about that the sea route of the Joseon 통신사 2 was quite dangerous, and all the records left by the Joseon 통신사 about their experiences, how they see the sea, the ocean. So, and you analyzed all 12 the stories of Joseon 통신사's journal to improve the understanding of Joseon 통신사. So thank you very much about your good presentation. It was very helpful for me. So due to the time limit, I want to ask only one question, one thing. The size of, in regard to the size of Joseon 통신사, in page 75 of the material, there were 12 Joseon 통신사 groups were organized and dispatched since 1607 to 1811, but the number from Korea and Japan, the number quite different. So I compared this document with other table from different materials. The 3 were same, but the other 9, the number were totally a little bit different. It might cause problems, I think. So those are the parts that we need to research further. We need to make a research further. Thank you. Now, Professor Moon Kyung-ho from Gwangju University. I have a question to. I read a book written by Lee Geun-ho, and I also introduced that book to my friend. So I bought another book. It was really interesting and meaningful book, I think. It shows the shift of Joseon dynasty very vividly. I read very thoroughly, so I already asked many questions to you, but I had 2 more questions about. So first, the drifting journal was written after they back to Joseon. But there are another person who wrote while they stay in Joseon dynasty. So as Joseon 통신사, they investigated the ships very thoroughly, like to check whether the things they are not allowed it. But the Yasta group were not investigated. And when they back to Japan, I think they were thoroughly investigated by the Japanese people. So are there any records about it? And it is a kind of personal question, not to you, but in Goryeo era, the route to Japan departed from Gimhae or Masan. But since King Sejong the departure changed into Busan. Is there any reason they changed the departing area from Masan to Busan?
예, 감사합니다. 자, 그럼 마지막으로 우리 대학교 광고 홍보
And fourth,
지식문화센터
Professor Song Hyun-moo from Kosin University. So, taking this opportunity, I first knew that the drifting journal, drifting diary, it is very interesting topic, and it can be used as a origin content, as a kind of basic source to make a further contents, like making a new stories. So with our creativity, I think that drifting diary can be used as a good source. So I have a question to Professor Seo. So you said that depending on the level or class of those drifters, how they treated were totally different. So I want to know how different it was, and what was the. I think the more detailed information helped to make a story plausible. I think the public exchange has some limits. So this kind of private exchanges for commercial purposes, there were many kind of tries, like smuggling, I think. So those things are very interesting story to make a good product. It's a kind of adventure, I think. So those kind of stories can be. Is there any other stories related to this? Thank you. So, from Professor Seo, please answer the questions. So now, please finish your answers within 2 minutes.
Well, thank you for the questions, Mr. Jung. And he's a producer of a festival, and I think he has many insights as he asks us questions about this content. Well, I think I am a researcher, so I haven't thought about it, but it's a good question. So let me briefly answer to the question. Well, the drift records, there are many different types of records, and we also published the books about it. And the drift story to Joseon and also Lee Ji-ham's records on drift, they have many details and differences. So I think it's not just about the people, and it's about the goods and the customs and practices. So if we can really compile them well and put it into good contents and package them well, then I think, of course, we can create a good contents out of it. And of course, their characteristics might be different, but they are good materials. And to your second question, you talked about the smuggling. Yes, there were some cases, I guess, because their purpose was for trading. So in terms of doing the trade, well, smuggling, if they were caught, they're going to be put into jail. So they try to fake it as a commerce, or legitimate trade, but from these drift records, we can see some stories of the pirates and others, so it can be one way of doing that. Thank you. So, Miss An, the team leader of the Education Contents from Asia Culture Institute, I appreciate your contribution to our exhibitions and others. Now we move to Professor Kim.
There was 2 questions. Both of them are big issues. I couldn't give you an answer right away, but except for Lee Ji-ham's drift, there are other drifting story, make some changes in the recognition on the oceans in Joseon Dynasty. It would be a good topic to make a further research. So in general, at the end of the Joseon dynasty, there was a concept about the own territory and recognition to other countries, roles. So a series of books were introduced. But back then, there was no books were mentioned about like Lee Jiang's Drift, story of a drift. But maybe I'm not sure that those drift story might change the recognition about the Hokkaido or other areas. But I think that it made a little bit changes in recognition of Hokkaido. And in Joseon, we respect China back then in Joseon dynasty, but when we see the journal written by Joseon after Qing, the respect to the China. But only who drifted to the China left information about the China, the Qing dynasty, how brutal they were, but others didn't left any records or information about what the China was. Back then, the Tokugawa Ieyasu united Japan. Maybe some people in Joseon dynasty saw the Japan as a brutal, but many of them thought that they were friendly and good friends. I'm sorry, because of the time limits, I moved to the other questions.
Professor Lee, please. Yes, you asked about the goods brought by Yasuda and his group. In Joseon, we have a very detailed inventory of their goods, and they carried how many papers and how many bullets they were carrying. So it's a very detailed inventory, but it's kind of a very early stage of Joseon dynasty. But they had almost non-interaction with the Joseon people at the time. So in terms of the repatriation, they didn't have any chance to re-examine their belongings or their possessions. But what did they in Japan? Well, there are 3 different checkpoints: Uegan, Nagasaki, and Satsuma prefecture. So at 3 different points they had this re-examination. But for the other 2 cases, I think it's hard to have. In Uegan or Tsujima, you should ask another expert to get the right answer for that. And why did they have these much details in terms of these records? Well, it's kind of a report to show that they did their job well. So Yasuda could be punished for that, but he was reinstated to his own position after returning to the country, because with the reporting he was seen to have performed his job well. So I think that was a purpose, and that's why he had this detailed description or drawings. And also from Busan, and why the route has shifted to Busan. Well, I'm not sure about the changes in the policies, but Busan, as well, like Dadepo or Kadokdo, or the areas that they went to, and they moved through the Taiwan Current to Tsushima. So the starting point was not really important here, because they started they moved to the west and they took this Taiwan Current to get to their destination.
So last, the questions about from the Mr. Zhang, the Professor Ba, please answer. That was very good point. So about the Joseon Tongsinsa's record, the size of the number of Joseon Tongsinsa quite vary based on the documents. And the number of people who starts from the Busan might change in the way to Japan. So I really care about the number, but we can say that in King Sukjong's 737th, 조선통신사 crew was that shape that we made a statistics when we published it about the book. So please think all the number as a theme. Of course, we need to figure out the data from the Japan, and of course, the government officials left a document on same Joseon Tongsinsa. So according to the writers, sometimes the records differed. So I gave up to set up exact data, but anyway, the research on Joseon Tongsinsa, the theme of the research quite vary. So I think now it's time to make a deeper research to check the documents of both sides, like Korea and Japan. And sometimes the number of people might change due to some accident. So sometimes somebody moved to the first, like move the Japan with a horse. So sometimes they send to the Japan ahead of the Joseon Tongsinsa, so the number might vary. So I will take all those things into my mind and will make a deeper research to make a compensation. Thank you very much for your presentation and the discussion. Before we wrap up the discussion, we have some questions online. So, but due to the time limits, we only pick several questions. So, to Mr. Professor Kim, there is one question. You said about the drift sea route, but I think that it is possible to realize this sea route. Maybe he is a marine physicist. So, if we put a drift buoy dropped in the Busan and tracked by the satellite, we have some very detailed and specific data showing the route. So I think it is a good idea to cooperate marine humanities and marine science to do the research together. How about it? I am a humanist, humanitist, so I studied with the records. But to make a realize, I think this kind of cooperative research is quite welcomed. So one more question to Mr. E.
가장
As you researched this drift diary, what was the most interesting part? Well, they were mostly interesting, but what was most impressive to me was the Joseon government officials entreating or interrogating these Japanese drifter. They were very obsessive and meticulous in terms of conducting this interrogation and reported that on a very tight timeline, otherwise they may lose their or risk their life. So I think that shows a very strong and well working system of the Joseon officials. Well, any other people? We got a lot of questions, but due to time limits, I think we have to wrap up now. So that concludes today's session on Adrift Connections Around Asia, the special session 3. I'd like to thank all the participants for staying with us. Thank you very much.